Greetings, fellow human, and welcome back to Inside Awala, your backstage tour of this censorship circumvention technology. I'm your host, Gus Narea. I'm the author of Awala and the founder and CEO of Relaycorp, the company behind Awala. This show is primarily for diaspora communities from countries subject to severe censorship, and really anyone with an interest in using technology to change the world. Today's episode is about the origin of Awala, in particular, how North Korea influenced the architecture of the technology. I'm splitting this episode into 4 parts. First, how everything started as a dissertation project. Next, I share why I decided to use North Korea as the theoretical litmus test for whether Awala will work. Then, I'll share how I pictured Awala working in North Korea based on my research. And finally, with the benefit of hindsight, I'll share what I think worked with my approach and what didn't work. Part 1, Dissertation Project. It was 2016 and I had a full-time job whilst reading for a part-time master's at the University of Oxford. It was time to select the topic of my dissertation, and I decided to use the opportunity to try to bring connectivity to places that haven't got connectivity due to their governments. I had 2 specific use cases in mind. One, I wanted to enable people from those regions who were disconnected to connect with their loved ones, both within the region and beyond the region, so people that may have left the country. 2, I wanted to enable money remittance. So I wanted to enable people from that region that left a while ago to send money to their friends and relatives back home, because if the internet is cut off, it's very likely that the region is going through some very difficult times and basic things will have become more scarce and therefore more expensive. I also had one additional constraint, which is that I didn't want people to have to purchase or somehow get hold of some additional hardware. Everything had to work with their existing phones and their existing computers. This meant that the communication would have to be done over Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or USB cables. And I thought that that was a good thing to do due to costs and logistics. And also, it would be more discreet in case the government were to be looking out for people that had some special hardware. And because of that, I knew that obviously the range that you will get from Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and USB cables was not going to be enough to connect an entire region. I mean, theoretically, you could have a long-range Wi-Fi antenna that connects nearby locations, but that could have been easily detected and destroyed by the government, and also its signal could be jammed. As I looked into this problem and existing solutions, I could not find anything that supported the 2 use cases that I had in mind. I did come across some individuals and groups in Cuba and North Korea that would smuggle foreign media and would then distribute it within the countries at a cost to those that wanted to consume it. I also came across some offline communication apps like FireChat that was quite popular in the Hong Kong protests a few years ago, but that served a very different use case. And I also came across Project Loon by Google, which basically connected people to the internet via hot air balloons. I thought at the time that it was very good for natural disasters and regions that are disconnected due to the geography or the economy, but it was not going to work in places where the government deliberately wants to disconnect people because they will have to get a license from the government, and obviously they were not going to grant that license. I also knew that the internet could theoretically still work if the data is physically transferred. In fact, there is a standard to do just that with carrier pigeons, and it's been tested in Norway, South Africa, and other places, but this can only serve very trivial applications, not the kind of applications that you have on your phone or computers, because they will break as soon as you subject them to very long delays. The crux of the matter is that internet apps are too impatient and too chatty. Let's consider what happens when you go to Facebook to check what's new. This is what happens behind the scenes if you're using Google Chrome as your browser and Facebook.
Hello, I'm Google Chrome. Are you Facebook.com?
Hi, Google Chrome. Yes, I am. Here's my ID.
Okay, that looks good. So my user Phoebe, whose password is Regina123, wants to see what's new since last time.
Thanks. Let's see what's new for Phoebe. All right, I got it. So Ross shared a picture and Joey sent her a DM.
Fantastic. What picture did Ross share? And what did Joey say in the DM?
Ross shared a drawing of himself taming a dinosaur with the caption Ross can. And Joey said, "How you doing?"
Now, consider what happens if you're using birds or humans to transport data. Obviously, every message is going to take at least several minutes, if not weeks. And yet, Google Chrome and Facebook only have seconds, or at most a minute or two, to complete the whole exchange. So, in a way, internet apps are like phone calls when what we actually need in this case is the postal service. That is, you send a message and it will be processed at the other end whenever it's received. So at this point, I knew I had to create a secure postal service, if you will. With this postal service in place, Chrome and Facebook will get a secure communication channel, and the conversation will be more like this. First, Chrome will ask Facebook to be notified when there is new content for Phoebe. And this could take seconds or weeks, it doesn't matter.
My user, Phoebe, whose password is Regina123, wants to get the latest posts and DMs as soon as they're posted.
Eventually, one of Phoebe's friends will post a picture, and Facebook will send the following message to Chrome.
Ross posted a picture. It's a drawing of himself taming a dinosaur with the caption Ross can.
And then at some point later, Facebook will send Chrome a DM for Phoebe.
Joey sent a DM with a message, "How you doing?"
Now, unfortunately, this is much more difficult than it sounds. Making apps go from impatient and chatty to patient and direct is no small feat. We basically have to build new apps to use this new secure postal service. You will still be able to use Facebook and Google and all the services that you know and love, but they will have to be built from the ground up using an approach that tolerates delays. Fortunately, NASA and others in the space industry have been studying this space for decades. If you think about it, they also have to address the same fundamental issue as they send humans and machines further and further away into space. The International Space Station is far, but not so far that internet apps will not work. They work slowly, but they still work. But if we were to send people to Mars by 2040, traditional internet apps are not going to cut it. This field of study is called delay tolerant networking, and thankfully I was able to borrow a few ideas from it. By now, I had a high level idea of what I wanted to do, which fundamentally involved relaying the data until it eventually reaches the destination. So I did what any respectable nerd will do, and I named it RelayNet, as in network of relays, although I had to rename it to Awala a few years later. Part 2. Why focus on North Korea? I knew I had a moonshot on my hands, one that will take many years and a lot of money to make a reality. I didn't set out to target North Korea initially, but since I knew this was going to take so many years to materialize, I needed to use some region as a reference for the most challenging environment where Awala is to be deployed eventually. Sadly, the censorship you find in North Korea is far worse than anything else in the world, and I expected it to get worse over time. Also, people are always offline. This introduces some very difficult and interesting technical challenges because to prevent abuse, most services like Gmail and social media require you to prove that you've got an email address or a phone number to prevent people from creating many accounts and abusing the system. We could not do that because email, phone calls, or SMS was not going to work in this context. So we could not fix this as an afterthought. Let's also consider the alternative. If I design and eventually build something that right from the start, as I was designing it, I knew it will not work in a particular region, then it will just be a matter of time until all the other dictatorships will borrow ideas from that region to defeat Awala. I also considered Cuba and Eritrea, but I found the censorship there not as hostile as in North Korea. At this point, I knew I needed to learn more about North Korea, not just about the technology landscape, but also what people are like. In particular, I wanted to know about the challenges and opportunities that we will have there. I wanted to learn how they distribute this foreign information that I read about. And just so you know how little I knew about the country, how naive I was at the beginning, my original plan was to fly to North Korea with my bicycle and try to do a tour of the country. Now, in principle, I thought that that was not too suspicious because before founding Relaycorp, I used to do these kind of trips to remote locations. So I will fly my bicycle from the UK to anywhere, and I will just roam around the country. And I thought I could do that in North Korea, but I quickly realized that it was not going to work. You see, if you go to North Korea as a foreigner, you're going to be assigned a guide that is only going to show you the things the government wants you to see in the country. So I was not going to get an objective view of what the country is actually like. I did consider being a bit cheeky and try to find a creative way to get more information, but I thought that I would be putting myself and my guide at risk. So I quickly decided against it. So in the end, I just had to do research from abroad, and I read lots of resources, and one of them stood out. It's the book North Korea's Hidden Revolution by June Beck. I found it to be a great resource to learn what motivates people to distribute and consume foreign content. It helped me understand the motivation, the challenges, and the opportunities that our stakeholders will face there. I think that even now, 8 years after it was published, it still gives us that. So much so that reading it is part of the onboarding process for some roles at Relaycorp. Here's what you need to know about North Korea, which I think will be relevant later. First of all, North Korea is roughly the state of North Carolina in the US or Greece in Europe, and it has a population of 26 million people, which is close to that of Australia and Texas. North Korea shares a border with China in the north and just a little bit of Russia. And obviously, it's got South Korea to the south at the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. On the west, it's got the Yellow Sea, and on the east, the Sea of Japan. In North Korea, only the elites have access to the internet. Others can only access a local network that only contains North Korean websites. The phones and computers that you can buy in North Korea prevent you from accessing external files that haven't been approved by the government. However, some people have Chinese phones and they can use those phones to make calls near the border with China. Most of the escapees from the country come from the border regions with China. We know very little about the country beyond Pyongyang and the regions that border China. North Korean escapees pay at least 30% in fees when they send money to their family in North Korea. In some extreme cases, it could be close to half of the money they send. Some people use their foreign phones and laptops that get smuggled from China to consume foreign media, especially South Korean media. So basically, people smuggle CDs and pen drives and so on from China across the river, and then they distribute it within North Korea. This process of smuggling media across the river can be extremely challenging, not just due to the weather, but also due to the fact that you can get shot by North Korean guards. What people end up doing quite often is bribing the guards so that at least they get to leave. People will go to the black markets, also known as Yangmadan, to buy South Korean media, amongst other things that get smuggled from China. Then they will go home to watch or listen to the media that they got very carefully so that neighbors will not notice and report them. In some cases, they will share this media with friends and relatives. The North Korean government punishes anyone they see as a threat to their communist rule, including those that consume or distribute foreign media. Punishments include jail with forced labor under inhumane conditions and also death sentences. There is also a caste system, and the actions of your relatives can make you go down in this system. So if a close relative of yours leaves the country, you will be affected. I also learned that the famine of the 90s forced people to be more entrepreneurial to survive, which obviously contradicts the anti-capitalist ideals promoted by the government. Finally, I was aware of a big drawback of choosing North Korea as the reference for Awala. Even if I managed to eventually build this technology, its deployment to North Korea was going to remain theoretical for a long time due to two reasons. One, logistics. The only realistic way to transfer data into and out of North Korea would be via China, which, as I've mentioned before, it was very hard then, and it's even more so now. The other barrier is legal. Due to very good reasons, the United States has got sanctions against any kind of transactions with North Korea, and South Korea also imposes similar restrictions. Part 3. How I envisioned Awala working in North Korea. What I'm going to share now is the upshot of my research and design work. I did this at Oxford before founding Relaycorp and getting funding to build Awala eventually. The focus was on the technology and the logistics, ignoring the legal barriers that I mentioned previously. Generally speaking, my thinking was to leverage the black market and the smuggled Chinese devices. Some of these smugglers and traders of the black market will form a so-called courier network, leveraging the existing routes that they used for trading today. Awala data will be smuggled along with movies, magazines, and apps, although in the specific case of Awala-related data, they may not necessarily have to cross the border if they could use the 3G or 4G from a Chinese carrier within North Korea. Obviously, this will not work for movies because the files would be much larger. Awala also had to support end-to-end encryption so that neither the couriers or the government could inspect the data if they were to capture someone trying to relay this data and take their device to a lab. My thinking was that people would be using their devices at home, for example, to read messages from their relatives in South Korea and to write to those relatives. They'd periodically have to go to the Yangmadang, or the black market, to drop off the outgoing data and collect incoming data. This would have to be a very discreet process, done wirelessly and within just a few seconds. My assumption was that they were going to pay those traders in the Yangmadang to have their data relayed. I also noticed that we had a fantastic opportunity to exploit their domestic social networks to our advantage. We could use the equivalent to Facebook and other websites within North Korea to relay data that is totally innocuous. For example, we could use the equivalent of Facebook to share the picture of a cat or the video of a dog that actually contains end-to-end encrypted Awala data. This technique is called steganography, and it could allow us to reach those regions that are inland and not well connected to the rest of the world, as Pyongyang and the bordering regions with China are. As I thought about the context in which Awala would be used, I decided that it had to support the following properties. One, it had to be decentralized so that there were no gatekeepers dictating who can use it. Users will need some kind of sponsor to use it, much like you need Gmail or Hotmail to send and receive emails, but any person with the appropriate technical skills can be that sponsor. Second, it had to be open source for transparency purposes. 3, it had to be resilient to mass surveillance. I tried to mitigate the kind of surveillance that we know the NSA and GCHQ are capable of after the Snowden revelations. Not because I was worried that the NSA or GCHQ will target us or the people that we are trying to serve, but because I was worried that the North Korean government or other governments could compromise those systems. Lastly, for privacy reasons, everything had to be end-to-end encrypted, even in regions where the internet is still available. This is so that if the sponsors that I mentioned above were compromised, they could not read your data. I should add that I wanted these properties for the safety of my team and anyone working with us as well. If any of these properties were missing, our adversaries would have a very good incentive to target us. This exercise also highlighted the importance of risk management. As a systems designer or architect, my job is to optimize for some things at the expense of other things. It's a very difficult balancing act. There is no having your cake and eating it here. This is not something unique to technology. If you think about the role of an architect building a new bridge, or the members of parliament in the UK, or the Congress people in the US, they also have to manage this. We basically have to think about the first order consequences, which are the direct consequences of our actions and inaction, and the second order consequences, third order, and so on. What we're looking for are the positive, neutral, and negative consequences. If you've got a neutral, that's easy. You may not do anything about it. If it's positive, you may decide to exploit it or not. But the ones that I'm most interested in are the negative consequences. In this case, we have 4 options. One is to avoid it if we can do it without introducing another compromise that is not acceptable. The second option is to mitigate it, which means basically to minimize the impact should it materialize or minimize the probability that it would materialize. The third option is to transfer it to a third party, like an insurance company, for example. And the last option is to just accept that it may happen. Now, in the context of North Korea, the consequences could be magnified, both domestically and internationally. There are two examples in particular that were top of mind for me and I want to share with you. One is that a system like this will indirectly contribute to the corruption in North Korea, as people will have to pay corrupt guards and bureaucrats to distribute Awala data, just like they do for any goods that they smuggle. Unfortunately, here I could not see what I could do besides just accepting the risk. The second one, and this one is much more difficult, is that it could be used by terrorists. When Osama bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan, he used a rudimentary version of the system that I just described. He will draft emails on his computer, which was disconnected from the internet, and he will hand over those drafts to a trusted courier in a USB stick. The courier will then go to an internet cafe to send those emails and collect incoming emails. Awala would have given him a far more secure and convenient way to do that if it had been available in 2011. The best action that I could find for this was to mitigate it. This is the best we can do in IT, as it's impossible to tell the good guys from the bad guys with at 100% accuracy. Specifically, my plan is to block them. To block someone, you need to figure out who their sponsor is and then have them block the user, for example, with a court order. The big challenge here is actually finding what account is being used by the terrorist, as a network does not leak anything regarding your identity or geographic location. To do that, in this case, the intelligence services, such as the CIA, would have to capture somebody that bin Laden was communicating with and analyzed their phone in a lab. This is the best trade-off that I could come up with. I was not going to sacrifice the end-to-end encryption or the mass surveillance resistance, but at the same time, I was not going to let something like the dark web develop on Awala. Part 4, High-Level Retrospective. As I'm not planning to talk about North Korea again, at least not in Season 0, I wanted to share with you a small retrospective. The things that I think I got right and the things I think I got wrong. First of all, I think it was a good call to focus on North Korea. It remains the most repressive country, and it's got a lot worse and more sophisticated since 2016. Also, I had to put the project on hold for 2 years until late 2018 due to lack of time, and I eventually submitted the dissertation in 2019. I think it was definitely good not to have focused on Cuba, because the internet access in Cuba is now better than it was back in 2016. It's still a long way to go, and there is severe censorship, but compared to 2016, internet access in Cuba is a lot better. I also thought that it was a good call to try to mitigate mass surveillance. We recently learned that hackers linked to the Chinese government had compromised the systems used by the US government for wiretapping purposes. One bad call I made was that by focusing so much on the application of Awala in North Korea, I decided to have separate apps for the end user and the courier, like the Jangmadang trader, for example, in the case of North Korea. The fact that we have to distribute two separate apps for two different audiences during an internet blackout in the same region complicates logistics. My thinking at the time is that couriers in the context of North Korea will not need Awala, because they were either going to be in close proximity to the border with China, close enough to get internet service from a Chinese carrier, or they would be on Chinese soil using the standard internet access that they will get in China. Another bad call I made was that I underestimated the complexity that decentralization entails if you don't want to sacrifice the user experience. I mean, I'm happy that we did this in a decentralized way. My bad call was underestimating the consequences of this decision. In the end, we managed to make it decentralized, but it significantly delayed the project. I hope that one day North Koreans will be free and families will be reunited. Until that happens, I hope that at least the technical, logistical, and legal barriers that prevent escapees from communicating with their family and friends will be overcome. As you can probably tell by now, I've always seen this as a moonshot. Whenever I listen to Got My Mind on You by George Harrison, I wonder if I traveled back in time and wrote that song. An interesting side note, at least to me, is that even though I could not do a cycle tour in North Korea, I ended up doing that tour in New Zealand. I was supposed to be near Kaikoura in the South Island when an earthquake of magnitude 7.8 hit the region. Fortunately for me, I had to push back my trip by 1 week as my research on Awala was taking longer than expected, and the preliminary proposal was due around that time. The affected region was disconnected from the rest of the island for days. People were left stranded and disconnected from the rest of the world as phone lines and the internet were down. Although I wasn't stranded there, it made me consider how something like Awala could be useful in emergency situations, even in developed nations. I would have been left stranded there alone, with no way to check in with my family and friends. And I remember that, for example, the Royal Air Force was able to airlift emergency supplies to the region via helicopters. And I thought that those same helicopters could eventually play the role of Awala couriers. As a consequence, I saw emergency response as an additional use case that Awala could support going forward. However, seeing the recent developments in satellite communications, Starlink in particular, I think that those services will be better positioned to serve this use case, and Awala could be a backup, or more accurately, the backup of the backup. So now we've reached the end of the episode. Make sure to check out the show notes where you'll find references to the key points I covered here, as well as some memorabilia from that phase of the project. In the next episode, I'll be sharing the story behind the founding of Relaycorp and why I decided not to start a charity. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's catch up in 2 weeks.